I'm Karla Walker from CPR Classical. How do you compose music when you are profoundly deaf? That is the question that people ask about Beethoven all the time. How do you know that the notes that you hear in your head are, and the ones that you put down on a piece of paper are going to sound glorious, like Beethoven's Ode to Joy, written after many years of being profoundly deaf? The world's leading expert on this, Dame Evelyn Glennie, virtuoso percussionist and composer, joins me to talk about this. Thank you so much for joining me, Evelyn Glennie. So glad to see you across the pond on Zoom today.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
You tell the story that when you were wanting to go to music school, people would say to you, "How are we going to do this?" I'm wondering if Beethoven ever came up in those conversations, the story of Beethoven and how Beethoven was able to write music being profoundly deaf.
Surprisingly, no. It felt as though I was the only person on the planet who had a hearing impairment and could play music. So Beethoven did not come into the conversation at all. But I think, you know, we have to remember that music is a massive word. It's like an umbrella. And composing is one aspect, performing is another, perceiving the sound from an audience point of view is another, being a sound engineer is yet another, and it goes on and on and on. So I don't really think we can lump the idea of perceiving music in the same way regarding all of these different avenues of music. And we also have to remember of the soundscape that Beethoven was exposed to, which is a very different soundscape to what we live in today. We have a lot more higher frequencies, we have a lot more density of sound, there are less spaces in sound when we walk outside our door and so on. So there's a much greater level of sound actually hitting our bodies. And I think what was interesting from my point of view was that people in the late late 70s, early 80s, certainly the early 80s when I decided to study music full time, there was still this feeling that to be deaf meant silence. To play music meant sound. So basically the two couldn't come together. And so there was this oversimplification that was happening. And, you know, technology has really developed. So cochlear implants, for example, the different variations in hearing aids. Beethoven didn't have any of that, not at all. And we still don't know how Beethoven's voice was affected. We don't know what changes and actually the expression of his voice happened. And there are so many other things to consider in his situation. And I think that what happened with him was that he really, really looked deep and felt deep within his own sort of machine of the body, the human body, that incredible machine that we all have. And he really, I think, began to link all of his senses together. And this is what happens for any person who has a certain challenge, is that, okay, one thing may fade away or become different, but yet other things really come to the fore. And it's amazing how the other senses really do group together and become much more magnified and really work together. So I think when I started out, people were used to just thinking, if you're deaf, you can't hear, if you're blind, you can't see, if you're in a wheelchair, you can't walk, and so on and so forth. So for me, it was a case of trying to allow people to understand that my whole body was like a resonating chamber, like a kind of massive ear, as it were. And there is a part of the ear that can pick up rhythm, but it's not about hearing the rhythm, it's about physically feeling the rhythm. And we can all do that, whether you're hearing impaired or hearing. That is just something that the human body can do. So, but to describe that feeling is very difficult because people can't see it. You know, it's not something that you can physically see. And so it is really hard to talk about it and to explain what actually is going on. But I think Beethoven gave us the real beginning steps, you know, when he sort of clutched his teeth against the keyboard, when he did certain things, when he sort of curled his body around the keyboard, and then he had these big sort of megaphone things attached to his keyboard. He was basically trying to bring the piano in his human body, making it as one body, if you like. And that for me is really interesting as a percussion player, because of course, you know, most of the time I hold a stick or a mallet and I'm detached from the instrument. You know, unlike a violinist or a brass player or a wind player or something, you're attached to your instrument. Very often with percussion, we're detached, which means that we view our sticks or mallets as an extension to our body. It's like an extension to our hands, our arms, whatever it may be. And that's really what Beethoven was doing with his piano. He wanted to be in the piano, and he wanted the piano inside of him.
So when did you really become aware of Beethoven and his story? Was it after you had already started to play music?
Well, I remember, first of all, I started piano from the age of 8, and I remember having this tiny little book called The Great Composers or something like that, and it had, you know, Mozart, Handel, Beethoven, Wagner, and so on, and just a little blurb about each composer. It was basically for young people like myself, and I remember it said, oh, Beethoven was a deaf composer. And I didn't really think much about it. And even when I was beginning to lose my own hearing, I was never at that level to begin to understand what actually was happening to me. Because of course the body is so elastic, and young people don't feel, oh, I'm going deaf or something, and isn't that a catastrophe? The body is still developing, the mind is so elastic, and you just do things that young people do. And I think I might be a very different musician, or maybe not a musician at all, if I began losing my hearing much later in life, whether it was through my teens or even in my 20s. And I think I'd have a very different perspective as regards to my relationship with sound. But for me, I think I was young enough to really be flexible, elastic, to allow that body to open up in its own natural way. So really allowing things to internally develop rather than feeding external things. Well, you should be doing this, you should be doing that, and so on, and having other people tell me what should and shouldn't happen. And I think that I was fortunate enough to really let the body deal with the situation in its natural way, and then for allow myself to develop as a musician in my natural way, and how the body was telling me to do this. So, and that's really important. And of course, Beethoven lost his hearing later in life. And although we can read about his frustrations and his anger and being almost suicidal, there's still something that brings him back from that dark place. And I think that when you know you can do something, and in his case, write music, he may not have been hearing this music as glorious music or as the most phenomenal piece of music ever written. He might have still been reading his musical garden and thinking, well, I don't know if this is going to work, or if that's going to work, or what. I think, you know, with all the commissioned pieces and the composers I've dealt with over the years, very, very few of them, if any, in fact, I can't actually think of one, whereby they sit there in the first rehearsal being absolutely confident that they have written a masterpiece. They're always worried and you know, a bit nervous and wondering if, you know, if things are going to work out, or if they're going to need to change things, or whatever it might be. And and I would be surprised if someone like Beethoven, you know, just had that absolute utter confidence that, you know, he was always writing an amazing piece that 200 years on we think is absolutely glorious.
That's one of the things that I find so interesting about Beethoven is his music became more complex the older he got. His Ninth Symphony, it's 70 minutes long. It's has soloists, it has a chorus in it. It's an incredibly complex piece of music. And that's what is so fascinating, I think, is that his music became even more complex the longer he was deaf. And that boggles my mind.
Well, I think that, when I find anyway, in my situation, having a hearing impairment means that you're reaching parts of your imagination, parts of your sound world as it is, in ways that doesn't often happen in other situations. So you're seeing sound, you're feeling sound, you're imagining sound, you're making sounds up, you have your own orchestra in your mind. And so you may not be influenced by what is being played in the radio or on someone else's computer, or what's playing as you walk into a supermarket or something. You're very much listening to yourself. And all of the dynamics are very extreme, because that's often how you hear sounds. So sometimes sounds can be very painful. Sometimes they can be really faint and almost ghost-like. Sometimes they can be like a thud and very sudden and percussive. Sometimes you can just have this long, long, almost monotone type of thing going on. There's all sorts of things, but you find that you actually have to digest those sounds through the body. And I think that as he became more expansive with the sound world, he felt that he wanted to fill that room like a resonating chamber, just as he was filling his body. And it is fascinating. I think that he understood about time and duration much more. And we sometimes think of a length of a piece being really complex, but I think that he had the nerve to see this sort of space that he had to draw sound, he had to paint sound, he had to color that room with sound. And maybe in his mind, as he was chatting to himself, he thought, well, what would happen if I might, multiply my voices? Maybe, when you're speaking, the sensation is that it's kind of all built in your head, and you may not actually hear your voice, but you very much feel it, through your fingertips, through your chest, through your body, through your neck, and so on. So it isn't just a sound, it's a feeling. And I think that a lot of, his latter works really delve into this resonance of sound much more, the expansive sound, so dynamics vertically as well as horizontally.
I've heard people say that the way that Beethoven was able to write after losing the vast majority of his hearing is that he could remember. He could remember what a violin sounded like, what a cello sounded like, his piano, of course. So I wanted to ask you about that, because it seems to me what you're saying is that actually dims and something new and more expansive develops.
Yes, absolutely. I think it's a bit like a friendship, it's not about having as many friends as possible, it's the quality. And I think that really, again, bear in mind that he had less sounds to digest than we do now. We have more instruments. We have more percussion instruments, for example, than even when I started. A lot of times I'm coming across an instrument that is brand new, it has never been played before. The allophone is one example. And so you're looking at it, and you're looking at the material of that instrument, the shape of the material, the shape of the instrument, the size of it, the kind of it, the direction that is pointing. You're really analyzing it in so many different ways before you strike it. So you're building up that sound world within your mind before you're actually bringing a mallet or your hand down on that surface. And when you watch sight impaired people and you give them something like a tambourine or a drum or whatever, they very rarely immediately go bang, 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 bang and start playing the instrument. They take an awful lot of time to literally feel the surface of that drum, the texture of it, the shape of it, and really try to build up their sound palette from that particular feeling, the feeling of the shapes and so on. And it's absolutely fascinating to see that. And then very gently, they'll begin to explore various aspects of that instrument by tapping and striking and rolling their hands over it and all sorts of things. So they're developing techniques as regards to how to play the instruments. And so it's absolutely fascinating, really. And I just feel that I think Beethoven would have pushed the boundaries anyway. I think it was that time in musical history where things were going to change anyway. So I think it would have happened, but whether he would have written the music that he wrote, obviously no one can tell that. But I do think that just in a natural progression, historic progression, change would have been happening anyway during this time.
When did you start composing music?
Well, I probably always compose without realizing that I was composing, because of course improvisation is composing. And I remember, you know, when I was playing the piano as a youngster, 8 years old, starting out, I mean, it was all about exploration. So I was having formal lessons by learning to read music and so on. But of course, I was brought up in the northeast of Scotland, and the traditional music was all done by ear. So, you know, I had a real good combination of reading and paying attention to other musicians in a traditional sense. And I've always just been fascinated by improvisation and just, you know, playing what you feel, because we are sound creators. And, you know, it doesn't matter whether you play the paper and comb or the most expensive violin in the world, we create sound. That's what we do. And I've always had that fascination to create sound. So I think that all of this has been a natural progression into writing music for television, for films, for radio, for computer games and so on, to giving, you know, live improvised concerts and recordings. And it's been absolutely necessary for me as a percussion player, because I'm dealing with different instruments and I'm dealing with different types and styles and landscapes of music.
I've heard from some composers that composing over these past few months has been really hard. Being home, the pandemic, they just can't find the creative muse that they need. Are you finding that, or are you able to compose?
Well, actually, it's funny because I have found that in possibly a very selfish way, and I don't mean for this to come over in that particular way, but I have absolutely, I feel really benefited creatively from this whole like lockdown experience, because my whole performance life has been about preparing a piece of music for a particular date. And it's constantly preparing something for something. And that obviously has to be. And this whole lockdown, of course, has meant that the diary has completely evaporated of live performances as we know them. And it's given me the chance to really revisit myself as a musician and what's important to me. It's allowed me a much better life-work balance, because of course I'm so rarely at home, and now I'm at home, you know, 24/7 more or less. And it's been absolutely wonderful because I can really smell the birds and the bees and see the progression of things. And that has spilled over to who I am as a percussion player, as a sound creator, as a musician, as a composer. So it's allowed me to reconnect with instruments that perhaps I haven't picked up in years, because there's not the time to do it, there's not the energy to do it. I know that I'm not going to have to play that instrument in a performance and so on. So it's opened up all sorts of possibilities for me that I just simply have not had the time to do before. And I think that's been really, really interesting. So I think composing wise, a lot of the ideas have stemmed from that. And I think also it's not a bad thing for us all to be rocked to our boots, as it were, you know. I mean, this has been a horrible, horrible time for so many people, for so many individuals, for so many industries right across the globe, and we don't know yet what's going to happen. And so therefore, you know, music is a fluid subject anyway, and it's a fluid industry anyway, but it's really made us musicians think, who are we? What are we? What is important in what we do? What business are we in? Because I think for a lot of musicians, they've discovered that, oh, we thought playing our instruments 24 hours a day was, you know, is wonderful. And actually, well, what is there to fall back on? And there is this sort of perception that musicians will just play because they want to play, the love of playing. But they're realizing now that, hold on a second, we're in a business and we have to really think much more like a business, and we can still be creative, we can still come together and all of that, but just we have to understand this industry as a business.
I think about Beethoven, how he used to like to go to the woods outside of Vienna to walk, to get away from it all, probably for the same reason, to leave all of the work behind so he could fill his senses with nature and peace.
Absolutely. I think, again, this whole period has allowed us to connect with nature. It's allowed us to connect with people in a different way and in a more profound way, quite frankly. I think we've discovered that less is more, that we don't need so much of the baggage that we thought we did need. And it's allowed us, perhaps more importantly, to listen to ourselves, because listening can only start when it starts with ourselves. You know, what is that inner chatter? Because whatever that inner chatter is, it leads to an action. You know, so whether it's getting up in the morning, deciding to have breakfast first, or a shower first, or a shower, or a bath, or whatever it is, you know, whatever you decide, whatever you say to yourself, it leads to an action. And, you know, I think that so many creative people, and in fact people from many, many different industries, just need that moment. You know, it's not really we're not talking about, you know, sitting crossed legs like you know, in some sort of Zen or Buddhist state. This is just simply getting out, or just having a moment to yourself, just with your own thoughts. And I think that is extremely important. So absolutely, I can understand Beethoven hasn't done that. I think the one thing that I would say is that when you're listening, you know, we can all listen. That's not about whether you can hear or not hear. Hearing is a medical condition, but listening takes energy. You know, it takes focus, it takes time, and not just listening to a sound, but listening to what's unsaid, allowing a journey to happen with a situation. And that's listening. And that's what composers do, is that they might mull over one note, you know, for ages and ages and ages, just as a songwriter might mull over a word, a phrase, you know, two words, and just have that sink into their whole being. And it's hard to describe really, but you sometimes need this almost selfish like moments where you just sort of leave you know, normal life, as it were, and just sort of have that moment to yourself.
I've been wondering what the music will be that comes from this time, because composers will write music about this time.
Oh, absolutely, they will. And I think that we've seen through history that, you know, a great deal of our masterpieces have come from the most dark moments in history. They really have. Whether it's personal moments, you know, of depression or whatever it may be. I mean, so many of our great composers were so depressed or had so many issues in their life, but yet they wrote some of their wonderful, wonderful masterpieces at the height of those moments. And I think that, yes, you're right, it'll be very, very interesting. It'll be interesting how composers move forward. We don't know how long social distancing is going to be. Basically, we've seen any kind of live performances be fairly small scale as regards to the number of musicians. The composers that I'm talking to, who are full-time composers, are rethinking their performance spaces. A lot of them are actually rethinking how they want to configure an orchestra. And that's very interesting. I mean, I've been fascinated by that anyway as a percussion player, because we're so used to being in so many different parts of a hall or theatre or orchestra or whatever it may be. So that's quite normal for me. But I think composers are really, really, thinking of different combinations of instruments, different performance spaces, outdoors, indoors, derelict buildings, small venues, big venues, you name it. And that's all really interesting. And then obviously developing the virtual aspect, which I think still needs a good way to go. I don't think that we've got that emotional enjoyment yet coming from performing virtually. And certainly not the kind of, I think it's a plaster over the situation until we really get things to a high level. But yes, it's fascinating, and I think with all the doom and gloom and darkness, absolutely the grass will be greener on the other side, and it'll be fascinating to see how we will look back on this period.
I love your optimism.
Yes, well, we have to be, because life moves on at the end of the day, and with all the historical moments that we are aware of, we've come out of it, at the other end, and tried to learn more. And I think a lot will be learned from this, in many different ways to make society better.
Thank you so much for joining me and shedding so much light on how people can compose music in their minds in a way that most of us can't understand. It's just fascinating. Thank you.
Your pleasure. Thank you very much indeed.